We continue now with our Broward Health Injury Report with Dr. Carrera. In this report, we're going to talk about the common orthopedic injuries and should you suffer one of those injuries, whether it's a knee or ankle, what you should do.
So a good initial treatment that you can do for these injuries is a treatment algorithm called RICE, which is rest, ice, compression, elevation. So for any orthopedic injury or musculoskeletal injury, that's a good way to initially treat it and to help to shorten the time of recovery.
Of course, rest is one of the key elements, as you mentioned. Everybody wants to get back on the playing field, but with that rest, ice, and compression, how long would they be out?
Yeah, it really depends on the severity of the injury, so having a more thorough assessment besides that initial assessment is important, but certainly for the more minor injuries, that algorithm is going to help to speed that recovery.
And it works for both ankles and knees, right?
That's right. Covers it all.
All right, doctor, thank you so much.
Thank you.